On behalf of the Student Union, I would like to welcome you to tonight's discussion on American patriotism in the 21st century. If you could all take a moment to silence your cell phones, that would be great. Thanks. Okay. The Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan, student-run organization dedicated to promoting honest and open discourse throughout campus. The views expressed in this event do not necessarily represent those of the PSU or its members. Please visit our website, psu.pomona.edu, for information to find out about upcoming events or to join our mailing list. Patriotism has long been considered a paramount American value. From 4th of July celebrations to support of armed troops to immense pride in our representational form of government, America has historically been a nation of widespread patriotism. However, in recent years, approval ratings for Congress have dropped to incredible lows, support for armed forces has waned, and dissatisfaction with American politics and culture has become more prevalent, or at least more public. In fact, a recent poll showed that the percentage of people that think the United States is the greatest country in the world has shrunk in recent years, especially among young people. This dissatisfaction can be observed in the many public political movements such as Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, which express criticism and a sense that American politics are broken. Despite these shows of criticism, political candidates still speak of freedom, love for their country, and patriotism as paramount values. Have Americans lost their love of country? Has the way in which patriotism is manifested changed? Should we care about being patriotic? Tonight, we hope to explore some of these questions and examine the state of patriotism in the 21st century. To tackle these issues, we welcome 3 scholars from the Claremont College's community. Dean Miriam Feldblum is both the Vice President and Dean of Students, as well as a Professor of Politics here at Pomona. We are also joined by Professor Susan McWilliams from the Pomona Politics Department and Professor John Pitney from the Claremont McKenna Government Department. Tonight's forum will consist of about an hour of questions for the speakers, followed by a question and answer session with the audience. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, and without further ado, let's begin with a question for Professor McWilliams. All right, so our first question is, what does it mean to be a patriot in America today? How has this definition developed in the past few decades, especially since 9/11?
Well, one of the things that you said I think is really right, that patriotism is a word and a concept that sits very uneasily with contemporary Americans, which is largely, I think, why we're gathered here today. Patriotism is for many of us a fraught term, especially to thoughtful people, I think. And so we don't use it very much. I rarely hear my Pomona students call themselves patriots in public forum. And we don't really get too close to the word or the concept in our daily lives. Instead, we squint our eyes and encounter patriotism from the kind of safe academic distance that we're doing today. That is, we ask our professors to discuss patriotism for us and we watch. Right? That's as close as Pomona students can to get. This kind of anxiety about the word patriotism shouldn't be too surprising. Whether or not you put the terrorist acts of 2001 or subsequent military activities into the equation. Patriotism has been a fraught term for Americans for much longer than that, and I would actually say probably dating back to pretty close to the founding. For one thing, patriotism is a member of a family of political words. Words like reverence, duty, loyalty, sacrifice, nurture, legacy, covenant, that are largely absent from our political discourse. They're largely ancient political words. American political rhetoric, by contrast, is largely modern, increasingly dominated by the language of rights and liberty and opportunity and choice. From a very early age, from the time we're very young kids, we Americans are taught to define our lives by our opportunities, not by our obligations. In a land dominated by what the scholar Mary Ann Glendon calls rights talk, that is, everything is about my right to do this, my right to do that, language of individualism. In a land dominated by the notion that life is about taking what you can get rather than paying what you owe, patriotism is a really hard sell. Moreover, to be a patriot, quite literally, is to have a patrimony, to have a sense of patrimony. A patriot is someone who has a sense of legacy, a connection to the past. This is a way of living that's in fact alien to most Americans. From the very beginning, Americans have been a restless and mobile, uprooting and uprooted, displacing and displaced kind of people. Patriotism is a hard sentiment to muster among such a people, we who have little evidence of any connection to the past in our lives. One of the questions I'm fond of asking my students, and my students in here will know that I ask this, is who can name where their great-grandparents are buried? Very few Americans can do it. I'd be surprised if maybe 5 people in this room could. If you think about that, the fact that for most of us, we're so disconnected from our own personal past, that our really proximate family past is obsolete to us, irrelevant to the way we conduct our lives. It's hard to think about how we can have the kind of sentiments that patriotism requires of us, which requires us to be connected to the past in a much more substantial, big picture way. The displacement that dominates American life makes the sentiments undergirding patriotism feel foreign to us, even if in the abstract we think of patriotism as desirable. So that's just only 2 ways in which I think patriotism as a concept is very foreign to Americans. But I want to say one more thing, because I think most Americans, truth be told, are simply without patriotism in any meaningful sense. And this large group includes people of all classes, people of all kinds of persons. These are people, some of you may be in here, who don't think unpatriotic thoughts, right? Who don't wish for the downfall of the Republic, but don't really think any patriotic thoughts either. This Republic for them is a vague and distant thing, absent from their hearts and lost to their eyes. If you want to have proof of that, just consider how few Americans vote and how few Americans have voted for so many decades. Voting really is about the minimal thing you can do to demonstrate some interest in the Republic at large. And a surprise, in many elections, fewer than 10% of registered voters are voting. Reflecting their indifference, our great patriotic holidays are now administratively arranged to provide long weekends, right? Martin Luther King Day, President's Day, we don't even celebrate Veterans Day anymore, Memorial Day. We use those less as occasions for shared patriotic remembrance and renewal of the political covenant than occasions to boost the consumer economy. This is a country where patriotism properly understood has been in decline for a long time. And one of the things I'll talk about later, if I'm given the opportunity, is one of the great worries that our political leaders have, starting in the 1830s, starting perhaps with Abraham Lincoln's speech to the Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, which is 1838. Serious Americans who are serious about our politics have lamented the fact that the kind of beliefs that undergird patriotism, which aren't, by the way, unthinking, unwavering devotion, but rather a kind of critical engagement with the place in which you live. That kind of concern has been evident among serious political thinkers in this country for well over 150 years.
Okay, so I may be the skeptic on this panel because I'm not quite sure patriotism is such a good thing. I think that the slippery slope from patriotism to nationalism to nativism is something which perhaps in theory can be more clearly delineated. In practice, we've seen it over the past few centuries. So for me, when I think about patriotism, I actually think that there's lots of signs of patriotism, maybe not in this critical, thoughtful manner that Professor McWilliams is discussing, but I actually think that's not what's being exhibited. With marches, if you think I'm an immigration scholar, so if you think about a lot of the anti-immigration politics, it's often under the guise of we are Americans. What does it mean to be an American? And in fact, if you look at the politics of today, in some way there's a little bit of a code that to be pro-immigrant is to be anti-American. I think that there's been different movements in history that have sought to reclaim Americanization and Americanism. So I think that there's been a long history of the linkages between nativism and patriotism and nationalism. I was looking at one encyclopedia and a quotation there, which I thought was also very good. Conveniently enough, it usually turns out that we are the patriots, that they are the nationalists. right? But we're going to define as patriotic, but when we see it elsewhere, maybe that's too nationalistic. So patriotism often encompasses inclusionary, or at least leads to exclusionary politics, because it's an us and a them. Kind of what we value is what we do and what we have, and that's distinguishing us from another group. Now, talking about the movements that have been more progressive, we can look at the Americanization movements in the 1920s, which was trying to support immigrant rights, defend immigrants against the exploitation in terms of labor, in terms of housing. But there too was an assimilationist movement for immigrants, kind of teaching them about sanitation, teaching them about diet. It's very interesting. American as apple pie. If we think about some of the foods that we think of, oh, they are so American, spaghetti and meatballs, even types of pie, those were actually considered not American. Great books written about the history of food, and especially the history of food in immigrant communities, that was a little suspect, un-American to be eating those. And it was a combination between diet and culture, so some rational thought, like that's just not healthy. But the progressive movement in the 1920s really sought to assimilate immigrants into an American culture that for some progressives during that time was a little bit more cosmopolitan, a little bit more multicultural, but it was also used in other instances as a more closed system. You know, here's how to become an American. In the 1990s and 2000s, so this is actually not connected to 9/11. In the 1990s, Barbara Jordan, who was a congresswoman from Texas, led an immigration reform commission that Clinton had put together. And one of the things they actually tried to do was take some of the values, kind of say, okay, the right has claimed patriotism, has claimed the Americanization movement, and we're going to take it back. That immigrants really have to value citizenship. So in both the 1920s and 1990s, there was a real attempt to increase the rates of naturalization, right? In order to say, and to revalue, infuse more value into citizenship. Now, it's interesting to think about when Professor McWilliams says, just a basic issue of voting, right? That's a sign of patriotism. Another sign, maybe, of patriotism as engagement in the community in which you live. Right? Patriotism is supposed to be love of country, right? Affection for the place, right? That could be community engagement. You actually don't have to be a citizen. If you're not a citizen, you can't vote. So you can't even show that example. In terms of where are your great-grandparents or grandparents buried, think about that at Pomona here. Probably close to a third of Pomona students are first or second generation immigrants. Parents may not be buried, grandparents may not be buried in the United States. So thinking about engagement versus patriotism, and historically we have so many examples, both in the past and current, about how patriotism kind of devolving into nativism is actually suspect, is actually problematic. Maybe we should turn this whole conversation around and say, what are we really trying to address? Are we trying to be more engaged with each other, with our place, with our community? What does patriotism have to do with it?
Professor Pitney?
Okay, the United States is among the most patriotic countries in the world. If you look at the World Values Survey, the surveys of national pride, the United States ranks extremely high. This is from the World Values Survey. How proud are you to be a citizen of your country? United States, 76%, compared with Britain, 51%. Compare the United States to other countries, these numbers are extremely high. And as far as expressions of patriotism, Gallup routinely asks this question, and well north of 80%, 80-90% of Americans consider themselves to be patriotic. Expressions of patriotism vary according to place. College campuses, not so much. Elementary and secondary classrooms, a great deal. Ball games, what do you do in the United States? At the beginning of ball games, you sing the national anthem. That's unusual among the nations of the world. So the United States, I'm not going to make the claim here that the United States is the best country in the world. I am going to make the claim that the United States, in certain significant ways, is different from other countries in the world, or at least other developed democracies. What does patriotism mean to people? And some of these have been mentioned. When people are asked what specific acts constitute patriotism, what answer do you think people give most often? No?
Serving.
No? Yes. Voting. By far. This is a poll by Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner. 78% say voting. Saying the Pledge of Allegiance, 70%. Working hard, now this is interesting. Working hard at your job, 62%. Volunteering in your community, 61%. There are other polls involving military service, and usually military service ranks above 50%. However, there's a big however, and I think this point has been made here, a gap between professed ideals of patriotism and practice. That's another issue. And despite the prevalence of patriotism in the United States, at least expressions of patriotism in response to poll questions, activity is a somewhat different issue. If you're familiar with comparative politics studies, rates of voting in the United States are in fact lower than in other industrial countries. Part of that reflects the long ballot in the United States. Voting in the United States is tougher than in other countries because we have so much stuff to vote for, much more so than other countries. Anybody want to guess how many Americans hold elected office? Anyone want to guess? 500,000. There are 500,000 elected offices in the United States. So in many places, a ballot is like an extremely complicated test, especially here in California. We have a lot of propositions on the ballots by yay picks, the pamphlets by yay picks sometimes. So that's a partial explanation, one that political scientists tend to favor, about low voting rates. Nevertheless, I think it's a fair criticism of Americans that the ideal of patriotism is one thing, and the reality of everyday life is something else, and Americans often do not live up to their ideals.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, while approval ratings for Congress dropped to incredible lows, very public political movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party are gaining support. Does this reflect a waning in patriotism, or can these criticisms be seen as an expression of national pride through the utilization of our national liberties? And we'll start with Tim this time.
I'm only going to speak very briefly about this one. So again, as I listen to the question, and I think about what patriotism, as we're interpreting it, we're defining it in terms of love of country, about concern for country, then why wouldn't the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street movement be signs of active political and social engagement? Right? I'm not quite sure whether there's a too narrow of an understanding of what we want folks, so that certainly it would be great if everyone voted more. The fact that there's a desire to engage in community, and there's also a practice we know from high school students and college students in terms of engaging in the community. I think there's a dynamic movement going on, and maybe we're using old definitions that are not able to capture new movements. I do think, again, in terms of the nativist trends in the country right now, is that there's it's difficult when I say resurgence of nativism, because I think there have been the ebbs and flows all along, but we're also seeing that. We're also certainly seeing anti-immigration nativist politics across states, but also nationally, and that underbelly of what has traditionally been defined as patriotism is very concerning to me. So less so some movements that are actively trying to go into the streets versus those that are very exclusionary movements. And you can, I'd be interested to hear from folks whether they think that both Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party also have some exclusionary tendencies. I think that could be a question.
Professor Pitney?
Right from the founding, dissent has been raucous and rowdy. Just look at the campaign of 1800. You think we have negative campaigns today? This is one in which there were newspaper op-eds that were essentially the C-SPAN of the time, accusing Thomas Jefferson of wanting children to ride on the pike and halberd. As far as disorder goes, hello, the original Tea Party was a riot. So the idea that sometimes these demonstrations get out of hand, whether Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party, I think it's great. It's Americans getting involved in their country, expressing their views, sometimes brutally, sometimes crossing the line, but that's been the case since the beginning. When I think of patriotism, I think of a line from the movie Stripes. Bill Murray said, "Our forefathers got kicked out of every decent country in the world." And expressions of patriotism in the United States sometimes take the form of raucousness and not simply saluting the flag.
Well, I think we're all in agreement here on that. I would agree that any kind of public-spirited engagement with the community, any kind of community engagement, and political scientists have been saying this for decades, things as simple as going to bowling leagues can really engage you in a community, and in that sense, allow you to meet people who are different from you, allow you to make connections across the community, and in that way are kind of the foundations of what we might call a patriotic sentiment. The sad part of that story is that not only are voting rates low, but community engagement rates have been on the decline, demonstrably on the decline in the United States since as long as we've been taking any measures of those. Fewer Americans are in bowling leagues, as well as fewer Americans vote, as well as fewer Americans go to PTA meetings, as well as fewer Americans go to town hall meetings. And so I think even if we take the measure of community engagement as something that we want to cultivate in the citizenry at large, or even beyond the citizenry at large, there's not a lot of evidence to support that. That's why I think people are so interested in the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. They seem in that sense to be very much working against what have been dominant trends. I also want to say one thing just as a point of correction. When I say, Americans don't know where their great-grandparents are buried, I mean those of us who have great-grandparents buried in the United States, and those of us whose parents, or those of us who are immigrants. Part of what it means to be American, whether your family has been here a long time or not, is that we all have ancestrally the experience of being very far. Our connection to our country is not an ancestral connection, fundamentally. And that is, for most of us, the links and the associations don't go very far back. So I wasn't trying to make a claim that, somehow if we were a nation where everyone knew where our great-grandparents were buried, it would be a better nation. It would be a different kind of nation. And I think that gets to something that Professor Pitney said. He said, America is different in some ways with regard to patriotism. And I would say yes, patriotism, if it's going to be in America, if we're going to have an American patriotism, it has to be different. It can't be the kind of patriotism that derives from the fact that our families all came from the same place. It can't derive from the fact that, we all fought in a war together. The revolution is many generations past. Abraham Lincoln, who I think did more serious thinking about this than anyone else, said that, well, if there's going to be any kind of legitimate patriotism in America, it has to be tied to those very few things that we have in common. For Abraham Lincoln, it was the text of the Declaration of Independence. He said, as long as I am acting with the ideals of liberty, equality, and self-government in mind, I'm being an American patriot. That's all that we can ask of Americans in terms of being patriots. So in terms of Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, to the extent that they believe themselves to be working in a public-spirited way with the eye to liberty, equality, and self-government, then I think by any reasonable definition of what we could expect of American patriotism, they're patriots. That said, I do want to just quibble with the question a little and say American support for the Tea Party has been declining. It's about a third less now than what it was a year ago. And support for Occupy Wall Street has been on the decline for the last few months too. So I'm not sure that where we are now is the beginning of an upswell of populist sentiment in the United States that's going to manifest itself in raucous community engagement. It may be, at least if the numbers trend in the way they've been trending, it may be the kind of end of a moment of that kind of populism.
Thanks. Our next question. How does patriotism influence political candidates and elections? How do candidates use patriotism throughout their campaigns? And what are the consequences of these strategies? Let's start with Professor Pitney.
Well, patriotism in campaigns is used in positive and negative ways. Positive ways, patriotic speeches extolling the virtues of Americans. One of the staples of speeches is telling the story of American heroes. That's all positive. One negative side, of course, is questioning the patriotism, either explicitly or implicitly, of your opponents. And that's an old tradition and a very bipartisan tradition. On one side, we've got a number of people who, to this day, are saying, Barack Obama was born in Kenya. And you show them, here's his certificate, his long-form birth certificate, and the birth announcements that appeared in the Honolulu papers at the time of his birth. And they were faked. A conspiracy so immense was able to go back in time and alter the pages of the Honolulu advertising. This is what is known as epistemic closure. Yeah, some of these people are, buses don't run. But in a sense, this is nothing new. You look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which we tend to think of as the high point of American discourse, and in many ways they were, but they're also rough. At one point, Douglas mentioned that Abraham Lincoln had opposed the Mexican-American War and said that he had taken sides against his own country in time of war, which is pretty close to the constitutional definition of treason. And mind you, these were the great Lincoln-Douglas debates. Franklin Roosevelt, in the 1940 campaign, one of his wrap-up speeches, "Something evil is happening in this country. When a full-page advertisement against this administration, paid for by Republican supporters, appears in all places, the Daily Worker, the newspaper of the Communist Party." This was FDR closing. The Tea Party, 2009, Nancy Pelosi wrote a newspaper article calling him un-American. So this is the downside. You see Democrats do it, you see Republicans do it. It's nasty, it's unfortunate, and again, it's this nasty side is one of the downsides of the uniqueness of America, because one of the standard epithets in American political discourse is un-American, and you just don't have that in a lot of other countries. I mean, you go north and people aren't calling each other un-Canadian. It's kind of hard to imagine what un-Canadian would be. Any Canadians here, you can tell me.
Well, I mean, I find myself in some ways a little bit uncomfortable, maybe in the way that I feel a little bit uncomfortable about some of the thrust of the questions in general, because I think, well, if you want to call patriotism wearing an American flag pin, right? Well, that gets manifest in campaigns all the time. Barack Obama doesn't wear an American flag pin. Suddenly, that's more proof that he was born in Kenya and he's a Muslim radical. He was out to destroy the country from within. Because I really want to encourage people, and I think a proper notion of patriotism in the United States is a more reflective posture. It's not just national pride. It's not just a belief in American. It's not, in fact, not just. It's not national pride. It's not American exceptionalism. Because I think patriotism, properly understood, is something, and I'll say more about this, that our country very much needs. I would say, well, I do think that most people who run for office and campaign, they're involved in the public sphere, they're engaged in their community, they are trying with their, and this is true for all of us, with their imperfect sense of what's just and right for the country. I'm trying to serve the country. I think that anyone who, and I exhort my students all the time to get involved in campaigns and get involved in offices and get involved in the kind of rowdy activism toward, whatever ends you deem just. I think all of that is patriotic. And so this is my way of sort of dodging the question and saying, look, I may really want Newt Gingrich to run mostly because I think you can have so many awesome double entendres now that we know what Newt's second wife says, right? And I don't support Newt's candidacy, but I do think in his own way Newt is a patriot because rather than devote his life to private ambition, he's tried to devote his life to the public good.
Okay, so as I'm listening, and as I was thinking about this, patriotism, you think about how Professor Pitney started off in terms of the negative connotations of un-American, and it becomes coded words in campaigns. So again, to think about how immigration is playing in both this year's presidential elections, think about it in state elections, it's not about the spirited engagement that I very much admire what Professor McWilliams is talking about. I actually think there's an endemic, problematic component of patriotism as it has played out. And so maybe we should start thinking about another word to use. If we're interested in spirited engagement, let's use that word. Because right now what we see in the elections is that it's being used to label some folks and some trends as un-American. It's being labeled to label populations as suspect. I thought it was very interesting when Romney, there was an article in the LA Times talking about how Romney and Gingrich were courting the Latino vote in Florida. Now, one, there's a problem with that term because you wouldn't use the term Latino vote in Florida, which they go on in the article to talk about the Cuban and Puerto Rican vote in Florida, who don't self-identify in really those ways, especially if you think about Cubans from the majority in Florida. But Romney had to say, I am very pro-immigration, right? That was his phrase in Florida. Well, there's a problem when you've been campaigning in other places, right? And really trying to distinguish yourself and having the cloak of patriotism and calling immigration into question. And then going into another state and actually trying to use that as, again, patriotic. So really what we have is a concept so malleable, right, being used in so many different ways. And I agree that both the Democrats and Republicans have been using it, that really we want to take a step back and say, does it have some analytical leverage? Is this worthwhile to use? So I think it's quite problematic the way we see it used in campaigns, and I think we should think about other terms to use.
All right, thank you. Our last question before the audience question section. Should we care about being patriotic? Is it an ideal that is important to uphold and instill in youth? And how is this reflected in college campuses? And we'll start with Mr. McWilliams.
Well, I think we're in heated agreement on this panel in terms of the kind of country we'd like to see, the kind of engagement we'd like to see. I'm willing to call that patriotism. Dean Feldblum might call it something else, and yet I think we're talking about the same thing, largely. I really do believe, maybe I'll elaborate on what I said before. I find one of the most moving speeches in the history of American political thought to be the address that Lincoln gives when he's not much older, frankly, than any of you, to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. And if you think about this, this is only 50 years or so after the founding. And one of the things that Lincoln says, then a very young man, he says, look, it was really easy to be a part of the founding generation in the sense that, they fought for these ideals, they enshrined them, they fought the scars, they knew what liberty had cost them, they knew what equality had cost them. They knew the price that they had paid. And Lincoln says, but now those scenes are distant to us. He says, we who came after the struggle for these founding principles and had no part in it, we can't see the evidence of those struggles and the scars in our body. We can't see and talk to people who made those struggles. He says, being distant, we can easily forget why they fought and died. We can't justly value the gift they gave to us. Lincoln also said, and I think this goes along with some of the things that Miriam Feldblum has been talking about, he says, and we also who come later are apt to see all of the mistakes and all of the imperfections, all of the things that keep us from living up to those ideals. But Lincoln says that doesn't make those ideals any less important. In fact, that makes it more important for us to recommit to those ideals against the kinds of injustices that we see in daily practice and life. He says if we forget those ideals, those founding ideals, our forgetting opens the path to very talented people of great ambition who, if they can't gain fame by preserving the principles of the founding, will gain fame by wrecking them. Lincoln says only if the founding principles, again, equality, liberty, and self-governance, are kept alive in the hearts and minds of Americans, will we be saved from corrupted ambition, or indeed saved from our baser selves. There's nothing, I think, necessarily, what I'm talking about when I talk about patriotism. I'd be happy to call it citizenship. I'd be happy to talk it community engagement. I'd be happy to talk about it as, care for the nation. I'm not so much interested in the term, because I think the real point is that it's as true now as it was in Lincoln's time. That if we lose sight of the founding ideals, if we allow ourselves to overlook the fact that enshrining those ideals is always a fight, right? There's that great line of Lowell's, truth is always on the scaffold and Rome is always on the throne, right? That you have to fight constantly to preserve these great ideals because of things like nativism, because of things like racism, because of things like corporate capitalism and the many ways in which it harms commitments to things like liberty and equality and self-governance. If you lose sight of that fact, then you really open up the regime to becoming the worst form of itself. So yes, to the extent that I understand patriotism to be a commitment to liberty, equality, and self-governance, which is manifested in public spirited engagement in the community, yes, patriotism is important. And if we don't have it and if we don't develop it, it's fairly clear that the republic will no longer be a republic.
Thank you. Dean Feldblum?
I applaud that. That's great. I mean, it's those sentiments I can completely agree with. I will note that there are many committed, engaged individuals in this country who can't vote, who haven't been given the full rights of membership. So in order to include those populations within that definition of public spiritedness, then that requires us to fundamentally transform our notions of patriotism, which, if you remember, we started off with voting, right? So in fact, when we think about committed members of this community, of all these communities, we really have to then rethink what we're asking for. One of the interesting research findings of Professor Will Perez from CGU, who's done research on undocumented students, he's a graduate of Pomona, was the really fascinating and actually surprising finding for the researchers when they were first looking at it, at how deeply engaged in community service and other kinds of civic engagement undocumented high school students were. That was actually, they were high achievers not only in school, but also in reaching out and doing all different kinds of service and activities in the community. Let's find a definition of patriotism that would encompass that.
And lastly, for Professor Pitney.
United 93. United Flight 93 on September 11th, 2001. Passengers on Flight 93 were delayed in reaching their destination. And as they were airborne, they were hijacked by Al-Qaeda. And talking to friends and relatives on airphones and cell phones, they discovered what had happened to the other planes on 9/11. So it was a moment right out of Tocqueville, what Tocqueville called self-interest properly understood. They wanted to survive. They had an extreme self-interest in surviving, but they wanted to prevent the plane from crashing into some site in Washington and killing thousands of their fellow Americans. So they did something else that was Tocquevillian. They formed an association of sorts. They got together. They hatched a plan. And it was right out of Hollywood Central casting. The passengers were black, they were white, they were straight, they were gay, men, women, an absolute representative cross-section of America. And they hatched a plan to crash into the cockpit and take over the controls. And one of them had been an air traffic controller, another had been a helicopter pilot. If they'd been able to do that, they might just have been able, with coaching from the ground, to manage an emergency landing. They weren't able to do that, but they broke into the cockpit, and the hijacker crashed the plane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And it was a tragedy, but this act of patriotism, and that's exactly what it was, possibly saved thousands of lives, possibly saved the White House or the Capitol building. And that was an example of self-sacrifice, service, willingness to do something that served your own interests, obviously, but also served the country. And that was a very dramatic moment. Now, we're not going to be called upon, I hope, to do something like that in our own lives. But when we're talking about patriotism, true love of country, it means thinking about something more than ourselves, something more than narrow self-interest. And we can express it in many ways: by voting, by community service, by working hard in our jobs and dealing honestly with our fellows. And that's the true meaning of patriotism.
Thanks to our panel, and now we can open it up to audience questions. So if anyone would like to comment, please go ahead.
I'd be interested, I don't know if anyone can comment on this, about the kind of public role and the political implications to support military conquest and military industrial complex and security states that have increasingly taken away the very rights that we claim that have we communicated with our lives. I wonder how in that kind of paradoxical role that patriotism in terms of
I can just say briefly, I think it was George Orwell who was defining patriotism as defensive kind of love of country and nationalism as aggressive love of country, but the example that you just gave there shows the slippage between patriotism and nationalism. So what's some of the, it's not that we should certainly be concerned about national security, but the way those arguments are used to advance aggressive movements, whether it's exclusionary movements, have been seen, not just in contemporary times, but I think it's occurred here also throughout history.
Well, I can only quote a great patriot named Dwight Eisenhower. "We must guard against the acquisition of power, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." And he was the one who coined the term, because he understood it better than anyone. And that's been a problem. And if one looks at criticisms of the military-industrial complex, some of them come from patriotic military veterans. I like to give an example of diversity of people who come out of the Claremont colleges. The 2008 Republican Convention, one of my former students was an alternate delegate, and at the beginning of John McCain's acceptance speech, there was this disruption in the galleries, and somebody, this big burly guy, shouting about his policies on veterans. I looked, oh my God, that's Adam Kokesh! Who was also one of my students. So there are a diverse array of ways of expressing patriotism, and one of which is guarding against threats to our civil liberties.
I guess what I'm having trouble thinking about is the story you told about the fight and is very well. It seems to me that that was more an act of humanity, and I would hope that those people would have done the same
Well, sure. And patriotism, in its best sense, is a special case of humanity, serving one's fellows because that's where we've been placed. That's where we are. And if we're going to express ourselves in service, the place to do that is among the people we're with. And to follow on that, after 9/11, there were many very concrete expressions of patriotism when it came to community service, volunteering. Sometimes it took military, in the form of volunteering for the military. Very often expressions of community service. And one of the heartening things we've seen in the 11 years since 9/11 is the increasing emphasis in institutions of higher education on community service. And a couple of very good articles in the Journal of Higher Ed today about that very subject. So it's not something that's unique to the United States. It's just a special case of concern for other people, concern for one's fellow human beings, but expressed in the context of a specific country.
Well, I mean, if you think about patriotism as a form of love, love isn't a zero-sum game, right? Just because I love my, my nuclear family doesn't mean I'm not also at the same time love my extended family. Doesn't mean I don't also at the same time love a wider circle even than that. So I would explain, I think in the same way Professor Pitney did, what happened on Flight 93 is love of humanity and it's patriotic, right? It's both. It doesn't need to be an either or. I think too often that we think that it has to be one or the other, and of course it's not. I would say in the wake of 9/11, I think it's interesting the way in which colleges have gotten interested in civic engagement. Though I think in some measure that's happened because of this awareness that that kind of engagement isn't practiced in the culture at large. This idea that we have to enshrine it formally means that we don't think people do it of their own accord. We have to teach you that habit in school. That means we don't think you're getting that habit somewhere else. And in fact, if you look at the statistics about what American civic and community engagement since 9/11, it's in fact continued to go down, even in the immediate months following 9/11. I think that had to do in part with the national leadership at the time. President Bush had this amazing opportunity. Americans after 9/11 wanted to do stuff for their country, right? You could have said in the month after 9/11, all right, I don't know, everyone, dig up, part of your yard, or give half of your clothes away to, you could have told people would have done anything. And President Bush said, hug your children and go to the mall. That's all you need to do. I'm not paraphrasing, hug your children and go to the mall. The message from the highest level of government was not, in fact, get more engaged with your community. It was keep the economy going and take care of the private sphere. And so, in fact, if you looked in the year after 9/11, how Americans' behavior changed, Americans weren't more likely to volunteer. They weren't more likely to join community associations. They spent more time, the only thing they spent more time doing was watching television. And so even when we think, and a moment like 9/11 might crystallize all sorts of patriotic engagements, both good and bad, it doesn't necessarily do that. And I think in some ways, of course, I would oppose the kind of nativism, the kind of exclusionism that Dean Collins is talking about, but I'm more concerned in the spirit of Alexis de Tocqueville about a kind of pervasive indifference that most Americans seem to feel toward the public sphere. That is, that they're not only not inclined to really help humanity or their country or even people in their neighborhood, they're mostly sort of hunkered down in their own lives, concerned about a very narrow scope of people near them. I've gone far afield from answering your question, but it seems to be all.
Lena and then Maya.
And that line of thought, I think it's interesting to look at the social discourse on both parties that they interpret, liberty and equality and self-governance differently. Where the one thing that seems to unite them is they think that protection of America's GDP is one thing that can ensure both of the other three. So I would ask you all to elaborate on what you think that would be if American prosperity is really what undergirds
Well, it's kind of hard to do anything else if you don't have the economic means. There's a place for that. And partial defense of Bush. I think he could have done more to encourage volunteerism, but he was facing the possibility of a much more severe economic downturn. And he later explained it, although again, he could have done a lot more. So, one very partial defense there. Charitable giving. You have to have money in order to give it away. So I think there is certainly a legitimate place for developing economic growth, but it can't be the only.
And I would say there's some interesting contradictions, right? Because if we're protecting prosperity, increasing growth, and then if you look at, sorry to go back to this, the anti-immigration laws of numerous states, you think about Alabama, you think about Georgia, you think about Arizona, and in fact it has been detrimental to their state's economy. And if you were a free market capitalist, you would actually be pro more immigration coming into this country. So I think that there's certainly a lot of interest in protecting America's prosperity, but policies and politics don't always go in that direction. And therefore, the question of where patriotism fits in, right, is that there could be a cosmopolitan business person, who is more inclined to think that in order to increase the prosperity of the U.S. economy, it's really to kind of open up the flow of migration.
I mean, economic growth has been used to justify all sorts of things that run counter to equality and liberty and self-government. It's been used to, currently economic growth is used to justify, or at least not justify, but we all turned a blind eye to, the near slavery conditions of the people who make our iPhones. I was surprised to see the extent to which Steve Jobs was deified when he died. As Eric Alterman, we were just talking about him, has written, Steve Jobs pushed the profits of Apple up and very consciously chose to lower and lower and lower the wages and the quality of living for the people who produce the things that we consume. So I don't think economic growth is a negative thing, but I think we should be the kind of cult of economic growth that I think you're talking about, where we say economic growth justifies all sorts of incursions on people's dignity and on our fundamental belief in human, not just American equality. And in our belief in the liberty for all people and the ability of all people to live self-governing, be self-governing, and our desire for them to live dignified lives. I think that we should be careful because once we start to see economic growth as more important than those things, then we're already gone a long way to undermine the republic in the sense of it being a republic.
Well, can I just say also that then there's so much offshoring that's going on with jobs, right? The 700,000 jobs that Apple, I think it was, that Apple contracts out of other companies, mostly outside our borders. I think it's very easy, all of a sudden we're going away from the kind of notions of patriotism because those business practices and those companies can be considered, really extolling the conditions of the individuals in this country, even though there's certainly a lot of exploitation of labor in this country as well. But the love of country doesn't extend beyond borders. So I think we're kind of trying to say, oh, patriotism, love of humanity and country, when often patriotism kind of stops at the borders.
But actually, this segues on to my question. So patriotism that you've been describing is more that spirit of engagement and fighting for the spirit of liberty and equality, rather than some kind of idea that America is the best. And so my question is, does that have borders, or since that is not it doesn't stipulate that it's an American spirit, fight for that as citizens of the world, or does it have no patriotism? Does that stop once we outside America?
Well, I think what Professor McWilliams said was very much on point. It's not an either-or proposition. Just because you love your country doesn't mean you hate the rest of the world. I think we have an obligation to support our country, fight for our country. Doesn't mean we agree with every policy of our government. But I think there's an appropriate place for love of country and patriotism, and at the same time recognizing the needs and the rights of people elsewhere in the world. And that's also an American tradition of observe and breach. But Americans have been a fairly generous people. Our level of governmental foreign aid is low compared with other countries, but if you look at private foreign aid, that is the money that Americans donate voluntarily, either through charities or through remittances to individuals, we rank among the highest countries in the world. So these are patriotic Americans who are helping people in other countries, and I don't see any conflict or contradiction.
All right, let's give our speakers a great round of applause.